I assume that you'll now be recording just what I'm sharing on the screen as well, so that's going to be a positive too. So we looked at then Mr. Rochester was at home when the fire broke out, the issues of insanity, intense feeling, and madness in our two monsters, the liar Jane Eyre, confined to the bedroom, similar to Bertha, the mad scarlet woman in the attic, engorged in flames here again in scarlet, as she sort of slips, she casts herself off the parapets there. And this is also Jane Eyre, obviously. It's that another romantic obsession is with youth, children, and innocence. It's the first time that children really very strongly come into literature as individuals and characters. Stories like David Copperfield begin to start with children in a Bildungsroman or maturation plot, and children's versions of books abridged and produced. We saw Robinson Crusoe, didn't we, from the 1770s, 1776 it was, at a very early phase. After the Red Room incident, Jane, full of deceit, Jane Eyre the liar. Notice her name, Eyre, as well, so she's like a spirit, isn't she? A pixie, a fairy, just in her sort of what her name might symbolize or represent. Of course, education, if we think about civilization contra nature here as well, we know what, we can imagine what's going to come with her civilizing her in the forms of education. It involves very sort of macabre pseudo-Gothic torture, basically, throughout her education. We also touched on this, the figure of Rochester, and I think we've already looked at potentially this wonderfully Gothic woodcut, one of the illustrations from, I'm trying to remember if this wasn't the original, was it? It was a version from the 19th century. I think it was the 1847. Could have been, though. There with Pilate, Mr. Doggington's down at the bottom. You could assume that this would be not necessarily a heroic character, but it's the cult of the hero is very important in romantic fiction, and we can see here as well this sort of very dark figure emerging from the mist, that eventually at the end you don't hesitate to take a place at my side, do you? That does climax and resolve itself. Talk about a resolution in a plot, in obviously a love story between the two, but two almost anti-heroes, if you will, two protagonists that do not conform to civilization and society's mores in any way. Rochester, noble, and as a result of his nobility, seemingly ignoble. And Jane Eyre as well, we all know from the story, is honest and constant and loyal, and yet obviously she's laughed at in polite society due to her station in life, being poor, when of course, as we find out by the end, those that we seem to be, there's an inversion and a role reversal, because Rochester in this rotting, crumbling setting seems to be rich, and in the end he's not, he's impoverished, and Jane Eyre, the pauper, the orphan, the liar, ends up through the rich uncle being wealthy. And I love this squiggly drawing here as well. Are you happy, Jane? So there we have Jane Eyre in short, and some of the issues, some of the genre conventions from not only the different genres that sort of that intermingle, the romantic element and the Gothic, the fairy tale, played out against a realistic setting nonetheless. And lots of people who know Jane Eyre from earlier film adaptations often don't see the Gothic and most realist, a lot of the original Gothic elements have now been reintroduced into, particularly in the 2011 version, which I'd strongly recommend. So at that stage, it's time to stop the recording, and I'm going to ask you to